Hey there, my name is Megan and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing a fantasy series for beginners. So I'm going to tell you guys about my journey getting into adult fantasy, and then I'm going to give you some recommendations of some other series that I read later on in my adult fantasy reading career that I think that you would enjoy and be able to get invested in if you are just beginning your fantasy journey. These series are also series that if you are looking to transition from YA fantasy into adult series would be a good place to start. But before we go ahead and get on into the video, if you are not already subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button as well as the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I post new bookish content. I post new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, and sometimes throughout the week. Also, don't forget to check down in the description box for links to my social media, my Buddy Read Discord, and my Patreon, where you can be entered into winning quarterly book giveaways. The way that I first got into fantasy is Harry Potter, obviously, but I'm not going to be discussing Harry Potter because it's a middle grade series, but I started reading Harry Potter when I was in the 7th grade, and then I remember when the Lord of the Rings movie came out, and I went to see it with a friend, and I didn't know that it was based off of a book, and as soon as I heard that there was a book series, I went and bought it. So, in my opinion, if you are looking to get into fantasy and you have not already read the Lord of the Rings, then that's where I would start. Yes, I've had the same series since middle school. They have like these horrible movie covers on them. Oh my gosh, they're so bad. But yes, one of my favorite trilogies of all time. And the reason that I like The Lord of the Rings is because it's got this just fairy tale-esque tone to it. It's just so magical. And then the characters are just so sweet, and Bilbo and Frodo and Sam, and they're just such lovable characters. And just the way that Tolkien just crafts this world and just makes it so fantastical. I love it so much. If you're someone that just likes that traditional medieval fantasy type, then this is a great place to start. So we have the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King. And then we have The Hobbit, which I actually read years and years after I read the original Lord of the Rings fantasy. And do I suggest starting with The Hobbit? I think it's a great place to start, but you don't have to start with The Hobbit to read the trilogy like I did. And I used to read this with my 7th graders because I love it so much until the state changed the curriculum. But yes, one of my favorite books. I think it's just a great place to be entered into the fantasy genre. The next series that I got into as an adult fantasy reader was the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. I no longer own these books. I unhauled them, I think, like last year because I finally realized that I was never going to read the series again. This series will always hold a special place in my heart. I know that a lot of people don't like it. It gets a lot of criticism saying that Terry Goodkind was stealing ideas from Tolkien. And like, look, fantasy ideas are recycled. And as like a 15-year-old fantasy reader, like I didn't care. I just wanted a good story and I liked this series. But it follows a guy named Richard, and he lives like kind of on this village type town, and it is separated from other countries by a boundary which is filled with these like beasts and no one can cross. But one day he sees a woman walking through the woods and there is someone trying to attack her. He saves her. He learns just about this whole other existence of this world and magic, and kind of embarks on a journey with her and an old wizened wizard. The reason that I like this series is because it has a lot of that like traditional fantasy tropes, such as, the farm boy that gets taken away on a mission and learns that he has magical powers, and then there's an evil dark lord. Then you have like the mentor character. There's just all of those traditional tropes that we read because we like them. So I read this series. I remember liking it. If I had to read it again as an adult, I actually think I tried to read Wizard's First Rule again and I couldn't get through it. But if you're someone who has never read fantasy before, I think that this would be a really good place to start. After the Sword of Truth series, I dabbled in Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. I picked this book up at the bookstore, didn't know anything about it, and I really, really liked it. I read the first 4 books in the series. I remember I was visiting my cousin in Florida, and she offered to take me to the bookstore, and I like the way these books look. I like the covers, which I don't know why because they're horrible, but it looked like fantasy and something I would like. So I grabbed the first 4 books and I read them, and I never continued with the series for one reason or another. As an adult, I have read more of the series. Still haven't finished it though. And I think this is a great place to start because I feel like Robert Jordan's writing is very accessible. You know, it's not too flowery, it's very straightforward. He is amazing at building this super, super complicated world in a way that is not confusing. He makes the magic system extremely clear. You know, how everything operates in his world is extremely easy to understand. Nothing is convoluted. And he develops just this epic story that is built upon and built upon and built upon book after book after book. So you find yourself getting invested in these characters and this story and this world and what's going on, and it's easy to follow along with. So I think that Wheel of Time is definitely a good place to start if you're looking to get into adult fantasy. Just know that you are probably going to be invested in this series for a decent amount of time because there are 14 books total. And I think the next series that got me into fantasy was Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is another case of me going into the bookstore and picking up a book that looked interesting, and this actually sat on my shelf for several years before I finally picked it up, and I was absolutely hooked, and I immediately bought the second two books in the series. So we have Mistborn, The Well of Ascension, and The Hero of Ages. So this series is definitely what started my love affair with Brandon Sanderson, and the reason that I would suggest this series is because, very similar to Robert Jordan, Brandon has a very, very straightforward, accessible writing style, and the way that he crafts his world, he does it very carefully, very believably, and he builds upon these stories in a way that the reader can understand, so that at the end of book one, you are so invested in the story that you just want to read books 2 and 3 to find out what happens. He also includes a lot of history and a lot of lore with his worlds so that it just has this epic feel to it. And this series definitely has an awesome magic system, one that is very cool, very unique, and very engaging. So this book, just plot, world, characters, has everything that you would want if you're just getting into fantasy. Because the next series that I personally got into after Brandon Sanderson was Robin Hobb, and that was the Farseer trilogy. And I thought that this book looked cool. I remember I had a gift card to Barnes & Noble, so I was looking to start a new fantasy series, and I researched a little bit of Hobb, and I was like, I'll give it a go. So I ordered Assassin's Apprentice, and I read it, and I really liked it. And then I picked up Royal Assassin book 2, and I actually read about half of this and I DNF'd it, and I remember being a little bit bored with it, but I knew that it was not going to be a permanent DNF. I knew that I wanted to finish the series, and I knew that I would eventually come back to it. So actually about 2 years ago, I started this book from the beginning because I remembered everything that had happened in Assassin's Apprentice, but I didn't remember very much that had happened in Royal Assassin. So I picked it up, and I absolutely loved it. I loved being back in this world. I loved being in Fitz's head and just experiencing what he did, and I just loved watching him grow as a character from like more of a child into this young adult teenager young man, and definitely my favorite book in the series. But the reason that I recommend the Farseer trilogy is because, once again, this world is so well developed. This book is not so much about the magic or the magic system, it is more about the characters and their growth and development and what happens to them throughout their lives. So there is a plot, there's a very strong plot. Magic drives some of that plot, but it doesn't drive other parts of it, if that makes sense. So I feel like if you're looking for a fantasy that is super character driven, that will really, really tug at your emotions. I mean, I got sad reading this book, I got super angry reading this series. And I just thought to myself that she writes characters so well. So definitely an author and a series that you should check out if you're looking to get into fantasy. Now I'm going to be showing you guys a couple of series that I think are good starting points if you're just starting to get into fantasy. These are series that I have read within the last couple years, and I think that they're not heavy on the magic systems, but they're good on the plots. The first series is the Study series by Maria V. Snyder, and it includes Poison Study, Magic Study, and Fire Study. And there are other books that are in this world that I have not read. I have only read this one original trilogy. Poison Study follows a girl named Yelena, and she is in jail. She's about to be executed, but she is given the option to avoid execution if she becomes the commander, who's kind of like a ruler, his food taster. So she has to learn how to identify poisons. So Yelena accepts, and she ends up learning how to identify poisons and things like that. So Yelena gets just mixed up in the politics of what's going on in this world. Yelena actually discovers that she has magical powers, and she can't remember a lot of her childhood, but that does come back to her, and she kind of learns where she came from. The reason that I would suggest this book is, first off, it's got a really cool world. Like in book 2, we are actually introduced to like this jungle. civilization, and it's really like nothing I've ever read about in any book. I found it incredibly unique. And I feel like the magic in this is kind of like there's no parameters. So it's just magic exists and these characters can use magic for these things. Whereas in like Sanderson, there are rules. So in this world, there's really not a lot of rules. You can just use magic to do things. And I feel like if you're someone that's just getting into the fantasy genre who might not want stringent parameters on your magic usage, then you would enjoy this. Also, this series is super quick to read. It is very fast paced. There's always something going on, and it's just an easy fantasy to consume. I personally liked it, and the magic was fun. It was fun, so I would recommend it. Next, we have the Gilded Cage trilogy by Vic James, and those books include The Gilded Cage, Tarnished City, and Bright Ruin. The Gilded Cage is actually more of a dystopian fantasy, I would say, than just your traditional fantasy. I would describe this book as a dystopian with magical elements, but in this world, it takes place in Britain, and there are people who can possess magic called skill, and then there's people who don't, and the people with magic or skill kind of rule over the ones who don't have it, and the people that don't have it are forced into 10 years of slavery during their lifetime. So obviously, this book follows their uprising and revolt against the skill users. And there is magic in this book, obviously, but very similar to Poison Study, there are not a lot of parameters surrounding what you can do with it. And there is a couple of scenes in here with one of the characters where he enters this like dream state and just sees these things and accesses this magic. And I'm like, that was the coolest part of the whole series. I wish that Vic James would have included way more like magic like that. But this book is definitely more politically driven, and it's definitely more about the uprising than it is about the magic. Magic kind of just exists, but it has to exist to drive the plot because they're the ones that rule over the people with no magic. So it's definitely a series that I would suggest if you're just getting into fantasy and you really like dystopian. And the books are also fairly short. They're easy to get through once again. So a good series to start for fantasy beginners. And lastly, we have the Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab, and these books include A Darker Shade of Magic, A Gathering of Shadows, and A Conjuring of Light. In this book, we follow a world where there are 4 parallel Londons, and magic used to exist in each one of these Londons, but over time, magic has been erased from all but one of these Londons, known as Red London. And we follow a main character named Kel, and he is an Antari. Antaris possess blood magic, and he has to use this blood magic in order to access these different worlds. So it's kind of like a portal fantasy, if you like portal fantasy. But I personally like the series. I haven't read the last book, but the first 2 books I really enjoyed. I think the world is really cool. I like the idea of the different Londons and just the history behind what happened to them. And I really like Kel's role. He's kind of like an ambassador between the different Londons. I found that super interesting. The magic is, once again, really easy to consume, really easy to understand, and it's just a huge part of this world. And I really like the mystery behind it because there are some characters in other Londons that possess similar abilities to Kel, and it's just interesting following their journey. And the villain, or at least the villain of the first 2 books, is kind of your just traditional evil villain, not too well developed. I don't know about the 3rd book because I haven't read it, so you're not dealing with a like super complicated antagonist. Definitely a series that I enjoy. It's a lot of fun, and I would recommend it if you're just getting into fantasy. All right, you guys, so those are some recommendations if you are looking to get into or read more adult fantasy, but you kind of don't know where to start. You might be a beginner. Let me know in the comments the first books you read as a fantasy reader, or if you have any suggestions for people that are just getting into the fantasy genre. And I will see you all soon in another video. Goodbye.